I suppose when we think of this period, 1916, we're reminded of Mary McAleese's famous injunction about 10 years ago, that in Ireland we have a common history, but we don't have a common memory. One person's Easter rising, blood sacrifice on the streets of Dublin, is another person's Battle of the Somme, blood sacrifice of the flower of Ulster Protestant manhood on the battlefields of Europe. And of course, the same long, hot spring summer of 1916 would see the first official delineation of the quickly oncoming partition of Ireland in 1920 to 22, the famous Lloyd George scheme of the summer of 1916. And so, in many ways, when we look back to that period, there is this disconnect between the years 1912 to 14, to some extent, and that bolt from the blue, the Easter Rising. In 1914, it seemed that Redmondism, the home rule ship of Redmond, Dillon and Devlin, the Northern nationalist leader, was within sight of its promised land. Home rule for all Ireland, or most of Ireland, which was certain to become law by the fall of 1914, and indeed was enshrined in Home Rule on the Statute Book in September 1914. No one could have envisaged, despite the rising tensions in Ulster, that you would have a rising, a bolt from the blue, in April 1916, which would transform the course of Irish history, and which would give a list to that apparently predictable course, which no one could have foreseen before that. And I suppose we're thinking of that crease in time, which Conor Cruise O'Brien talked about many decades ago, between the death of Parnell in 1891 and the Rising of 1916, because so much of the detail of the Rising, the Gaelic revival, the IRB revival in Belfast by young men like Dennis McCullough, Bulmer Hobson, Ernest Blythe, was happening during those years. The birth of Sinn Féin under Arthur Griffith seemed as a fairly insignificant and indeed ephemeral party. Yet that name would become so resonant for those who wanted to identify with the cause of the Irish Republic after the Rising. And then, of course, there is the Ulster crisis of 1912-14. Carson's role in giving Ulster Unionism a status and a stature and a credibility which it had previously lacked in British mainstream politics. Carson, the Dublin lawyer, trying to save his island, his own people, in Cork, in Galway, his mother's aristocratic folk at Castle Ellen at Athenry, to save them from the horrors of Home Rule. And yet in the end, this all-Ireland unionist would be forced to settle for the best deal he could get for his northern unionist clients. And the tactics that were adopted in the unionist north and endorsed by Carson, and even more importantly by Bonar Law, the kind of Ulster backgrounded Tory leader of these years, would ensure the militarisation of Ulster unionist politics, the Covenant, the rise of the UVF, the threat to invoke force in the event of Home Rule being imposed in the north. And to that small nexus of revolutionaries meeting in Dublin, old Tom Clark, the Fenian reared in Dungannon, sentenced to 15 years in British dungeons, and then to America to link up with the O'Donovan Rosses and John Devoys, back in Dublin, linking up with the Young Turks from the north, McDermott, trained in Belfast, McCullough, Hobson, to that group who were planning that England's difficulty would become Ireland's opportunity. The rise of the UVF was the catalytic moment, the moment they had been waiting for. It was Bulmer Hobson who wrote that Ulster was opening a revolutionary door in 1913 with the rise of this illegal army, the UVF, which Irish nationalism, Irish republicanism must keep ajar. You had Owen MacNeill, born in Glenarm in the Glens of Antrim, writing about the North began, invoking the poem of Thomas Davis, the Protestant young Islander. The North began, the North held on. God bless the northern land. And where the North had gone in 1912 and 13, MacNeill argued in On Clive Sullish, the South must follow. Nationalist Ireland must follow. And soon, in consort with the IRB leadership, a new movement was launched in Dublin, the Irish Volunteers, and that would become the striking force. Part of it, at least, would become the striking force for the Easter Rising of 1916. And until recently, when we talked about these events north of the border, there was always a problem. When you talked about the covenant in a nationalist Republican community, they said it's not our covenant. And then you dug out the second pro-Home Rule covenant of 3,000 Ulster Protestants led by people like R.M. Henry of Queen's and Lord Perry and Roger Casement. And they could identify with the aspirations of peace and reconciliation with our Roman Catholic fellow countrymen in that document. And when you took the Rising to the Shankill or East Belfast, people said it's not our Rising. It was a stab in the back to the Ulstermen and the Irishmen who were fighting in the Western Front. And then you found the narrative of James Mitchell, the UVF man, the teacher of mathematics in Belfast Technical College, who at age 35 had had difficulty in joining the British Army. And he went to Dublin on Good Friday and went to Portobello Barracks. Found Dublin a very pro-British city, the separation women, aware that their husbands were fighting for, in the case of Southern Irishmen, for Ireland and the freedom of small nations on the Western Front. And James Mitchell would take the King's Shilling on that Good Friday 1916. But in choosing a day to go to Dublin with his friends, he certainly chose a bad day, because unbeknownst to him, the secret military council of the IRB, Clark, Pearse, McDermott, Connolly, were planning a rising that would go askew, thanks to the intervention of the northerner Owen MacNeill, and they would fall back on the Dublin plan. And James Mitchell, from 121 the Mount in East Belfast, from a family who had signed the covenant, would find himself immured in the Gresham Hotel, watching the rising unfold day after day. And we would find his 100-page testament in hotel notepaper in a bank deposit box in Cookstown, County Tyrone, in the 1990s, giving us a unionist perspective of the rising. Why did he never come back? That's another story. Or finally, the narrative of John Francis McEntee. Sean McEntee, born into a wealthy publican family in Belfast King Street. They had a string of public houses, and he'd been brought up above the pub, qualifying again at Belfast Municipal Technical College as an electrical engineer, responsible for the street lighting of towns like Dundalk and Wexford. The 25-year-old, Sean McEntee, as he'd Gaelicised his name, was a leading figure in the Irish Volunteers, the anti-war section, manipulated now with their 10,000 comrades by the IRB. And he would find himself involved in a mobilisation on the main Belfast-Dublin road on Easter week 1916. They centred on Castle Bellingham. An RIC man, a native Irish speaker from County Donegal, as his grandniece reminded me recently, was shot dead in a fracas in Castle Bellingham. In the end, McEntee from Belfast was sentenced to death. But he was finally, his sentence was commuted, thanks, as he reminded his daughter in the 1930s, to the intervention of a Belfast Unionist councillor, a man called Thomas Alexander, who happened to be coming up from Ferry House races with lots of Northern Unionists on that sunny Easter week, and had been stopped by the volunteers under McEntee's command. Knowing the McEntee family, Thomas Alexander, the Unionist councillor, gave a good account of the young leader of the volunteers who was spared. And Mara Wakati, the Gaelic poetess and daughter of Sean McEntee, recalls in her memoirs that in the 1930s, she was brought to a house in the Malone Road to meet a grand old man sitting in a conservatory, whom her father said had saved his life, this Belfast Unionist, who by then was the coroner for Belfast and had condemned the 1935 riots as caused by the speeches of men in high and important positions. So many links with the 1916 Rising. We're going to explore these this morning. I want to call on our first speaker, Dr. Tim Bowman. Thank you very much.